Yeah. Can we, okay, your PowerPoint, share screen.
I can't share screen. According to this,
Okay. Alright, you can start.
Hi, Yinka.
Hi, Mosumola. Hi, Helen.
like, I don't know. The laptop. I don't know why.
Okay. So while we're waiting for Helen to share a screen, do you have your presentation ready?
Helen is here. I'm Helen. I know I'm using
Oh,
LS
yes.
conference. Okay.
Yeah. So I
So
was
you want me to
asking,
speak first?
yes, from the email I sent, like you'll be the first speaker, I believe.
Okay, so that means you rearrange the order.
If you don't want to be the first speaker, it's okay. Is any other person willing to be the first speaker?
Sure, I can start.
Okay, that's okay. Thank you very much, Yinka. So, Yinka will go first, and then we can have Helen, and then Adana. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So Yinka, can you share your screen?
Yes, I want to make sure I close every other thing and have just this one.
Okay. All right. So while doing that, I'll just give a brief introduction. Thank you everyone for being here. My name is Mosumola Adeojo, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Florida, and I'm the chair for this panel. Our panel is Nigerian Women in Print Culture and on Social Media, Decolonial Dimensions. I and Odunaya Adeojo came up with this panel to invite scholars to examine how women in Nigeria have used social media, traditional media, and digital media in general to engage in different topics from relationships, love, sex, politics, and so on and so forth, and how they've also created safe spaces on, these different platforms. So today we have 3 presentations, and each presenter has between 12 to 15 minutes, or you can use just over 15 minutes because we have 3 presentations on this panel. So once once you have 5 minutes left, just look at the chat. Look at the Zoom chat. I'll be sending prompts once you have 5 minutes left. Our first presenter is Yinka Arawomo. So Oluwayinka is a 6th-year PhD candidate in the Department of English, Composition and Rhetoric program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has taught first-year composition for 4 years and supported her students in the writing classroom and one-to-one tutoring in the writing center. She's the past TA Assistant Director of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Writing Center and the incoming Vice President of the Online Writing Centers Association. Her research interests include digital writing and rhetoric, Nigerian women's discourses in digital spaces, and African feminism. So Yinka, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
All right. So can you share your screen? Thank you very much. So Yinka's topic is digital tabooing, Nigerian women's rhetoric of sexual pleasure and agency. You may start with your presentation. Thank you.
So can you see the entire screen or is minimized?
Right now it's minimized.
Okay. Just a minute.
Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just a minute. Okay, let me see. Is the screen gone?
Yes, it's gone.
So what can you see now?
For now, nothing.
I would have to pull that up again.
Yeah, that's okay. So while Yinka is doing that, if we have from the audience, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A option, especially for our online audience. You can use the Q&A tab and type in your questions. If you have any during the presentations, and after all the presentations, we'll have questions from the audience.
So I'll try again.
All right.
Okay. So what can we see now?
Yeah, we can see the presentation.
Yeah, so I had to download it as PDF so that it doesn't interfere with my script.
Okay, that's okay.
Sorry for that. Okay. So I'll have to make do with the PDF, so I'll start. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Arawomoluwa Yinka, and this presentation is part of my dissertation examining Nigerian women's sexual discourses online as sexual rhetoric, digital feminism, and as African feminist rhetoric. So today I will be examining Nigerian women's rhetoric of sexual pleasure and agency as digital tabooing online. So when I refer to these discourses as digital taboo, it suggests that Nigerian women are reclaiming the agency to broach the silence on sex and disrupt the shame that is associated with it to enable counter-sexual discourses. And although I study different digital text and platform, the excerpts I have today are from 4 sources. The first one is the one I call Voices. The other one is Dear Nigerian Women. And the third is from BBC Africa Lagos. And the fourth is from Our Intimate Secrets. So these are blogs or posts that I'll be drawing the excerpts from. So I identified 3 moves in women's discourses. And these moves include identifying the sociocultural influences on their sexual lives, critiquing the dominant sexual discourses, and the third move is articulating the possibility of pleasure and agency. Most times I like to use power, sexual power, for Nigerian women, even in context that seems to stifle this. The strategy that makes Nigerian women move from silence to conversation that does something, that shifts the conversation from don't talk about sex to men pleasure, then women pleasure is what I call rhetorical dialoguing. Yeah, it suggests that dialogue is central if women must both talk about and experience pleasure and exercise their agency. And these 3 moves, for me, parallels when I look at the literature on decolonization, it parallels the colonial practices of challenging hegemonic knowledge, systems of control, and enabling indigenous knowledge or alternative forms of knowledge or being. So, and the 3 levels of this dialogue that I identify from the data include the dialogue with self, dialogue with systems, and dialogue with other sisters. So I'm going to unpack this more in the discussion. So first, what is the exigency necessitating Nigerian women's own rhetoric of pleasure and agency? Sex is regarded as a taboo topic in Nigeria and Africa, and especially for women. And the dominant sexual discourses that we have that are prevalent excludes women's voices and views. And it also distances women from, and when I mean women, I mean Nigerian women. That's what I'm studying. So I don't want to keep repeating Nigerian. So it distances women from sexual pleasure and projects them as lacking sexual power and being passive in their sexual relationships. Also, we often hear of sexual violence and Nigerian women. So there is a need for the paradigm of pleasure and agency to highlight the dynamic and complex dimensions of women's lived sexual experiences. So I'm going to go to the first move, and that is identifying sociocultural influences. And some of these excerpts helps me illustrate the points I'm making. I would read just one because of our time. It says, many women are brought up with a socially conservative attitude that good girls just do not talk about sex. Part of the problem we face in Nigeria and Africa generally is that women are shy about negotiating their sexual pleasure, she says. That's from BBC. So in the first move, women demonstrate an awareness of the sociocultural context in which they negotiate their sexual lives by identifying some influences shaping sexual pleasure. They establish the cultural silence around sex and how women are expected to have a conservative attitude. Cultural and religious discourses that it cites, and this is also in agreement with other studies, and reinforce sexual norms that inform, control, discipline, regulate how women can dress, talk, and act sexually. So in one of the text voices, we see the women identifying such things as ekoile, and that's the Yoruba word translated roughly as moral or home training. So we see other words like upbringing and society, religious texts, traditional folklore, cultural and religious identities alluded to, such as I'm a Muslim and such things are considered haram. And that's the use of, and that is masturbation that this lady was talking about. Then we are Christians and such topics were not just broached. So the second move women make, again illustrated with these excerpts, is critically engaging dominant sexual discourses. So I'll read one of the excerpts again, and I would elaborate on that. It says, guys, what is the color of your problem? Why do you want to be poor in bed and wizards at the same time? So in the second move, women critically engage dominant sexual discourses. They challenge the dominant rhetoric of sex for procreation and sex for satisfying men's sexual needs. Such conversations impact women. It results in lack of bodily awareness and it distances them from pleasure. As we can see in excerpt 6, we move from save yourself from marriage, be a virgin, you marry, then we are talking about satisfying the husband, and there is nothing about women's pleasure. Also, as we can see in excerpt 4, it also affects women's material life. A woman who is scared of touching herself, in that sense, again, self-pleasure, wouldn't clean up properly because of the fear or the consciousness. And so they also critique men's privileging and dominance over women's orgasm or sexuality, as the focus has always been on men's pleasure, as seen in excerpt 5 and 6. So in Dear Nigerian Woman, the author calls out and condemns men's control over how women get orgasm. We see such scathing comment as the abysmal performance of some guys, failed woefully at. Some men have no clue on how to please a woman. So to make room for pleasure, women push back on these dominant discourses. So the third move women make is to articulate sexual pleasure as a possibility and also to give evidence of sexual pleasure, even in such contexts like Nigeria. Again, we have excerpt there. I'll just go to the discussion also because I'm aware of time. So we see that the third move women make is to articulate, like I've said, they make anecdotal claims about women enjoying pleasure, enjoying sex, and being actively involved in negotiating their own sexual lives. They give arguments about the importance of intimacy, even as far as the society and the nation. They link sources that would help them support their claim. So they are making arguments. These discourses, they intend to create an awareness about women's pleasure. And the goal is to enable conversations that center both. So for women, they redefine what sexual pleasure and agency means. It's about reclaiming control and honing their orgasm. It's about advocating for women's sexual pleasure, just as men. It also demands that men acknowledge and satisfy women's sexual needs. So women are still redefining what pleasure and agency means from them, rather than being shrouded in silence, secrecy, shame, and guilt. Both pleasure and agency are intertwined. It's an awareness of your body for pleasure. For women, it's discovery, it's exploration, it's being expressive, it's negotiation. Women argue that sex desire is part of their human experiences. And women are equally, they have the agency to search and to experience pleasure. And there are different ways of satisfying their pleasure, which includes the use of sex toys, masturbation, self-pleasure, using sex enhancers. Their narrative tells women engaging even in non-conventional sexual practices like BDSM, they are in non-heterosexual relationships, and sex is happening not necessarily in the context of marriage. So women's pursuit of pleasure do not always conform to the norm. So very quickly, I highlight the dialogues that I observe in the text, and it interacts with these moves I've mentioned. So the first is dialogue with self. This is a point where a woman is, interrogating herself, reflecting and thinking on the things that have shaped her sexual beliefs. For instance, I had to overcome all this idea. I had to let all my walls down. I have to push against every wandering thought. So these are the internal dialogues, the tensions that are present in our sexual choices. And this coincides with the first move. The second dialogue is dialogue with self. This is the point where dialogue with systems. This is the point where women begin to question and push back on these dominant discourses, as I discussed the second move. So they push back on these discourses. They engage them critically in order to make room for their own pleasure. And the third is dialogue with sisters. This is the point where women have conversation with other women to make sense of their sexual experiences, especially when it has to do with sexual pleasure. And the digital media is enabling such conversation, because such conversations are limited in our conventional public spaces or traditional media. So this is an ongoing project, like I said, and I look forward to our dialogues that will continue to help me to shape my thoughts. So thank you so much for listening and for our future dialogue.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Yinka. So a quick, okay, yeah. So, Helen, are you ready? Okay, all right. So once again, thank you for your presentation, Yinka. While Helen is setting up, just a quick summary of your presentation. You discussed how women, Nigerian women, breach the subject of sex, pleasure, and how, there are three levels of dialogue they engage in, which is the dialogue with the self, them, and with sisters. He also examined three moves: the move of, how sociocultural factors that influence sexual life. You discussed how women critique dominant sexual discourses and challenge the dominant rhetoric of, sex for procreation. And the third move is how women articulate sexual pleasure and agency by reclaiming sexual pleasure as reclaiming the control on sexual pleasure, and also expressing sexual agency and orgasm through some of these discourses. He also ended by explaining how digital media has helped a lot of women have these conversations, because this forum or the site is has less control as opposed to traditional media, where there's a lot of criticism on how women have this conversation. So thank you once again for that presentation. Now we have Ellen Ufoma Uga. Our presentation is titled "For the Love of Orgasm, Sexual Agency and Pleasure in Nigerian Women's Personal Sex Stories Online." Ellen Ufoma Uga holds degrees in English language from Obafemi Awolowo University. She specializes in discourse analysis and pragmatics, as well as new media discourse, political discourse, and feminist discourse. As a self-motivated academic who is committed to female rights and empowerment, she strives to advocate for women free scholarship. Her research interest cuts across the intersections of gender and society, as evident in diverse phenomena and different contexts of human communication. She's presently working on women's personal abortion narratives. She's a recipient of the Lagos Studies Association Best Graduate Student Paper 2019, and she teaches English language at Elizade University, Nigeria. Once again, the title of our presentation is "For the Love of Orgasm, Sexual Agency and Pleasure in Nigerian Women's Personal Sex Stories Online." Thank you very much. Whenever you're ready, please.
I'm ready. Thank you. How do Nigerian women position themselves when they talk about sex in social media platform? What do they categorize as pleasurable sex, good sex, or crappy sex, so to speak? And under what conditions does pleasurable sex occurs? Well, of course, we cannot talk about pleasurable sex without talking about sexual agency. Sexual agency is the rights humans generally have over their bodies and their sexual studies, their sexual choices. It's also the ability to explore and control one's sexuality without any form of external control or exploitation. It also includes sexual choices in terms of whether to use contraception or not, the kind of sex, whether oral, penile, vaginal sex, or any other kind of sex that suits the person. Of course, sexual agency is always a prelude to pleasurable, voluntary, and sexual acts that are considered desirable. Generally, in many societies, there is the notion of gendered performance, which is to a large extent gender bias. Okay, the performance of sex allows women to, or expects women to be pure, such that if a woman shares or talks about her love for sex, she's categorized a slut, a whore, or a shawo, like Nigerians would say. So as a result, women are faced with the notion of either talking about their sexual desires and being ten-O's, or keeping quiet about their sexual desires. So we can say that the imperative of sex or coitus privileges men's sexual desires and pleasures when compared to that of the female. However, women's sexual agency is imperative for women's mental health. The World Health Organization considers women's sexual agency and rights as an important aspect of their sexuality, which has positive impacts on their sexual and reproductive health. So sex is not a man's thing. Sex is important for everyone mentally and in terms and as well as for procreation. Women's expectation of sexual satisfaction determines the extent to which they would enjoy sex. Also determines to how much also determines the degree of satisfaction they would get from sex. Literature has also portrayed women's sexuality as problematic and intimacy oriented, with pleasure being a rare occurrence. Now, if you look at the Nigerian sexual landscape, some Nigerian women or majority of Nigerian women attest to being sexually unsatisfied by their sexual partners. Studies have also presented women in heterosexual relationship in two dimensions, either being actively sexual in terms of being pleasure motivated, or actively being active participants in the sex, or being compassionate and should I say domicile during sexual acts. So to a large extent, we can say that most literature on women in heterosexual relationship are portrayed as women are less interested in sexual pleasures and rather are more interested in their partner's sexual needs. Well, I would say that as much as women's sexual pleasures is stifled in most sociocultural and religious societies in the world, sexual pleasure and gratification, like I said earlier, is the right of everyone. It is the desire of every male and female to enjoy sex, to gain gratification from sex, no matter their age, exposure, or religious belief notwithstanding. However, women's sexual pleasure is dominated or subordinated by traditional religious and social values and rated unimportant and undesirable when compared to males. If a woman complains that her husband or her spouse is not satisfying her sexually, she is most often castigated by society and referred to in derogatory terms. But we still agree that the role of women in heterosexual relationship is highly significant. Men need women to gain sexual pleasure, and women need men to gain sexual pleasure. But even at that, like I said, sex, and like I said, and as Yinka has reiterated in our presentation, sex is considered a shameful and taboo topic for most women in the Nigerian context. Now, despite the taboo associated with sex, the social media platform or new media generally has given women, should I say, the rights, the platform to talk about their sexual needs, their sexual desires, as well as how they gain sexual pleasures. Several women, or we can call them online celebrities, have utilized the social media platform to talk about sexual pleasures, sexual desires. Most notable of them is Easy Webede. She posts videos on Instagram and TikTok about sex and how women want their sex. So we can say that the social media influenced women's exploration of their sexualities and how they portray themselves online and offline, and it also shows the degree of their sexual agency. So this study wants to know or intends to investigate how women position themselves when they talk about sex and the pleasures of sex, how they categorize sex, and what they categorize as pleasurable sex when they share their stories about sex. Now, to get women's stories, I basically got my data from Finn, which is a group on Facebook for women only. I saw the articles by using keywords like sex, fuck, orgasm, bull, and the rest of all that, because these are words that are associated with sex. And the stories are adapted in their original form without any form of editing. The analysis is basically done using the thematic and discourse analysis with the aim or with the intention of showing how women portray themselves when they talk about sex, and also the nuances that can be gathered from such from stories about sex. Generally, I would say that Nigerian women portray sex as important. Like I said earlier on, desirable and pleasurable. Women love sex and would love to have good and pleasurable sex. So sex is not just a man's thing. Everybody, women also want to derive as much pleasure as their male partner when they have sex. However, the notion of pleasurable sex differ from each woman because naturally our wants and desires differ. So women have different notions about what they consider as pleasurable. So whether they are married or whether they are single, my data has portrayed that whether single or married, women consider themselves as sexual subjects rather than objects. So even though they are submissive or they want to be submissive to their partner, they do not see themselves or they don't see themselves or in an ideal situation, they do not want to be subject to their partner's sexual desires. They want to have their own desires and they want their partners to be able to listen to their desires and act out these desires during sex. So other findings include, okay, like I said, women's notion of pleasurable sex as evidence in the data. For some women, pleasurable sex is sex that is intimate and emotionally connected, such that each of the partners involved in the sex have mutual pleasure. One person doesn't get more pleasured than the other. So at the end of the day, it's such kind of sex is anchored on love and emotional connection. If I want to have sex with you, it's because I feel emotionally connected to you. And during the act of sex, you should consider my desire as well as yours. So if I'm not satisfied, then it's possible the sex will have to go on or we'll have to keep on trying until we both get pleasure from the sex. For some other women, sex is an insouciant act in the present. That is, it occurs naturally. It is unplanned. We don't have to book a time, book an appointment, or wait for the right situation or right place for us to have the sex. It's just something that comes naturally. For this kind of sex, arousal do not feature. So you can be having a conversation and then something just happened and you end up having sex. So for women in this category, sexual agencies depend on how natural the sex can occur. So even if the woman feels the desire to have sex before that time, she may have to wait for her spouse to have the same kind of desire or to feel sexually aroused before they will have sex. For some other women, pleasurable sex is sex that they can control. No, usually we feel that, okay, there is a general notion that men control sex, men control the pace, the time, okay, of the sex. But for women in this category, they need to be in control of the sex for them to enjoy the sex. So they are sexually in control. They are sexually assertive. They dictate the pace of the sex. They tell the men what they want. And for some of them, while in the act, they do not enjoy the sex or they feel the man is not giving them the kind of pleasure they want from the sex, they stop it. And that would be the end of the sex. So for these women, they exert their agency almost to the extent that they appear to be more powerful than the men. They know the power they have during sex, okay? And they go all out to exert the agency that they have. Also for these women, they are ready to, the women in this category are ready to try out everything. Sex toys, every position, whether rough, just according to how they feel. And if you can see the excerpt I have here, some women usually end the sex once they attain orgasm. Then for some other women, good sex is sex that is rough and wild. Like that is, they can be doing anything and their partner will just come at them and give it to them however they want. So for women in this category, would say that for women in this category reiterates Fesorov and Sargent's assertion that men associate sex with dominance and women with submission. So for these women, we could say that, of course, for them, sex has to be unplanned, but it has to be rough, wild. It could last for a long period of time, but at the same time, it could be very short. As far as they are not aware, as far as it just happened without any form of without being planned, and also as much as it is rough and wild. Now, there's for some women find sexual acts painful, but for most women, I could say that from this data, women want pain-free sex. So sex is only pleasurable or good when there is no pain. And of course, pain can arise for several number of reasons, maybe from the sex position and how lubricated they are during the sexual act. But for all the women, pain is a no-no during sex. And as far aside being a no-no, is a huge taboo that can take their mind off the pleasures of sex. And should I say lastly, good sex is self-pleasured sex. So for women that consider good sex as solo and satisfying, they do not need partners or any human to attain sexual satisfaction or orgasm. They prefer to do themselves so that they can derive pleasure from sex. In conclusion, I would say that Nigerian women enjoy sex as well as men. Though some of them may not talk about it in offline, online, they feel liberated and free to talk about their sexual desires because to a large extent, and because to a large extent there's a limit to how they can be castigated or labeled as worse when they talk about their sexual desires. Women are not sexually passive. They only appear to be sexually passive when the sex is bad or crappy, like most women usually say. And the roles they perform during sex, or the role they play during sex, to a large extent determines the pleasure they derive from sex. And of course, good sex for women is sex where both partners are totally involved in the sex. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. So while Adana is setting up, I'm just going to give a brief summary of Ellen Ilga's presentation. So Ellen Ilga started with a question of what do women classify as good sex? How do they write about sex and pleasure and sexual performance expectations? She started by framing how sexual performance expectations in Nigerian society dictate, how women are expected to act or discuss sex, and how mostly women are expected to be pure. And also how sexual performance expectations polices women's sexual desires. She then engages with how women's sexual agency is quite important because it's good for their mental health. And she used data from females in Nigeria to examine, which is a Facebook group for strictly women. And she uses data from this space to examine how, women discuss sex and sexual pleasure. The sociocultural terms, the terms that they use for sex reflect, sociocultural nuances. And from the findings, she saw that women portray sex as pleasurable. Some of them, for them, sex is a liberating space and a space for them to express their power and agency. And finally, she concludes that women enjoy sex as well as men. Liberation to discuss sex on online platforms is what helps women, to really express themselves online, limit to criticism when they express their sexual desires and pleasures online. So once again, thank you so much for your presentation. We'll have questions afterwards. Okay, so now we are going to have Adana. Okay, so while we're waiting for the screen to be back, so we're going to have Adana. Adana Ogbonna Oluikpe is a doctoral student in the Department of English at Louisiana State University. She considers herself a cultural studies researcher with major interest in Black transnationalism, feminisms, the question of African identity in contemporary societies, and how these interpolate with interactive media platforms. She has published articles and book chapters that engage with these interests. And Adana's topic is, our presentation is titled, Hi Guys, Digital Selfing and Making the Nigerian Woman. So I think you should be able to share your screen.
Yes, I should. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm just gonna share my screen and all right. I think that's my PowerPoint. All right. All right, so this is my topic. Hi guys, digital selfing and making the Nigerian woman. So I'm just gonna run you through the trajectory and core arguments of the paper before I read, because I'm gonna be reading. So I'm going to be exploring the blurring distinctions between the public and the private, how the proliferation of digital social media technologies is facilitating these eroding distinctions. And I'm also going to be looking at the emergence of revelatory culture and the projection of self in line with the logics of neoliberalism. And I'm going to be looking at the Nigerian woman as a neoliberal agent. So I'm just going to be reading, and I hope you can follow the train of the argument. So I will start by saying that a combination of hyper-consumerism and screen culture in contemporary Nigeria has blurred distinctions in private and public realms. In a social research article entitled "From Public to Private: The Development of the Concept of the Private," Joe Bailey describes this distinction between the private and the public as unstable and fluid. The changing dynamics of what is considered public and private has become a very interesting way of valuing and describing social change. In the context of this work, social media technology is viewed as redefining our ideation of public and private realms. This in itself reveals the end and the beginning of an era, as well as the digitally mediated nature of this epoch. The blurring of these distinctions is a result of the proliferation of social media technologies, and this has led to a hyper-visual culture and consequently the preponderance of revelatory culture. Remember, it is necessary to note that revelatory in this context is relative, as our definition of what information that is fit or unfit for public consumption is often organized by acceptable ways of being and codes of privacy and intimacy in specific societies. So with a focus on the Nigerian woman, it is necessary to note that in the Nigerian society, as in many other parts of the world, religious and social cultural prescriptions define acceptable female behavior. What this implies is that in terms of publicity, some things are permissible and others aren't. So female bodily functions, for instance, to a large extent occupies this domain of intimacy and secrecy. So Lauren Bellant, in a foundational examination of the concept of intimacy, considers intimacy as communicating with the fairest of signs and gestures, a process of sharing, sometimes a narrative of self and others within the zones of familiarity and comfort. In other words, communication of bodily functions is expected to exist within the zones of familiarity. It is therefore not surprising that very recently, a Nigerian woman's confession of experiencing a menstrual period while engaging in a record-breaking cooking competition was met with mixed feelings. By the logic of privacy and publicity guiding conduct in Nigeria, she had contravened the laws of publicity. So Shaka McLaughlin, in an extensive examination of virtual intimacy, describes intimacy through the lens of carnal sensuality. By implication, the conception of what is intimate and private in Nigeria, as well as in other parts of the world, is extended to issues of marriage and sex. So capitalizing on the blurring margins, as well as the proliferation of media technologies, the Nigerian woman centralizes herself and identity in a process of self-narration. So given the aggressive neoliberal impact on visual consumption in contemporary times, the Nigerian woman on digital media platform monetizes these revelatory contents. In other words, the Nigerian woman's digital self-assertion parallels the proliferation of audiovisual social media technologies and the growing reach of neoliberalism. So in this work, basically, this is exactly what I'm going to be doing. In this work, I explore the idea of self-narrativization as prevalent within Nigerian social media. I read the Nigerian female subject as a neoliberal agent, distorting this aforementioned private-public distinction by monetizing revelatory contents. I also examine a new tradition of female self-articulation anchored on these foggy lines between private and public realms, and as ways of subverting vehicles of power that render women silent and invisible. So I'm going to be drawing on media posts and the dynamics of micro-celebrity pages, and specifically the Diary of a Niger Girl on Instagram. So the process of revealing what might be considered intimate details of one's life to a vast virtual public on social media, going by standards and logics of a specific society, is what I refer to in this text as digital self-narrativization. This is an allusion to the narrative feature and essence of literature and mass media like television and radios, where genres like autobiographies, documentaries, memoirs, biographies, travel journals, diaries, etc., deal in accounts of the self and personal. These genres of self-narrativization provide us with a framework of recognizing the re-emergent variants of self-narration within digital spaces. So this diversification of narration into new and emergent social media spaces can be viewed as transgressing normative social cultural ways of being. So while form provides us with insight on the transgressions as presented within this work, the content produced and published by Nigerian women users on these media platforms offer us other ways of grappling with this idea of transgression, especially with reference to the spoken and unspoken rules of propriety in relation to the self and the public. So pages like Diary of a Niger Girl on Instagram exemplify not only how the self has become a neoliberal subject, but also how the centralization of self queries acceptable and established standards of social behavior in relation to what is allowed to be discussed publicly and what isn't. Neoliberalism is understood in this work as market-oriented expressions on social media platforms. I think alongside Wesley Stevens, who in a 2021 publication on Blackfishing on Instagram, is of the opinion that neoliberalism is predicated on the privatization of public resources. In relation to the self as private, neoliberalism operates through the internalization of strategies and ideas that design marketing commodities, which in turn restructures our perception of self and subjectivity. What this implies is that society is increasingly being organized by market and commodification, and these ideas and expression of market runs concurrently with the emergence of media spaces. With the reluctant, aggressive commercialization comes a self-promotional culture, what Susan Kempis et al. In their publication, Self-Branding, Micro-Celebrity, and the Rise of Social Media Influencers describe as self-branding. So the self is here understood as, with its baggage of intimacy, is a product marketed on social media. The Nigerian female social media content creator now engages a performance of digital labor, which often involves the revelation of self, which interestingly meets the demands of our very rather voyeuristic society. With that in mind, it becomes more feasible and understandable to see identity and self as viable commodity that can be sold and bought. Self, as presented here, refers to personal details, quotidian realities, or what might be considered private or intimate details of a person's life. These details do not usually conform to spoken and unspoken laws of propriety. From the content presented by Niger Girl, I argue that in line with pervading liberal ideals of contemporary women, she sells a self-image of a sufficient entrepreneur and Nigerian feminist to an audience of like-minded people. With this self-image, she asserts a considerable level of self-agency and awareness in a way that leans into neoliberal individualism, Kempis et al.'s ideas of neoliberal individualism, where capitalism and enterprise is predicated on responsibility and individual efficacy. In the process of expressing this image of self and individual ideals, she simultaneously uses her platform to broach topics that flout constricting rules of female propriety, addressing relatively private issues as it pertains to herself and other women across the country. Constructing stories from lived experiences, she feeds her predetermined audience with daily self-narratives that speak to her feminist convictions. Seeing a growing liberal sensibility among the Nigerian youth demographic, her feminist policies and ideologies that call on women to prioritize themselves, as reflected in her signature statement that once read that we live a full, deliberate, and purposeful life, has generated a massive digital traffic of like-minded youths. Her attempts at transparency on issues of sex and sexuality, body image, marriage, childbirth, finances, and other issues of interest to women subverts this culture of silence associated with these issues. So it is not surprising that on Thursdays, she playfully addresses issues of sexual preferences, sexual escapades, sexual failures, and other supposedly personal concerns in relation to sex. Although she entertains anonymous requests and comments in relation to these issues, they are handled unabashedly by members of her community, some of whom cite personal experiences as reference. She has created a collaborative network of digital peers, particularly women who possess an awareness of her life and activities as if to say that they know her. If friendship was before the domain of privacy and personalization, the media spaces have pushed these boundaries, redefining friendship and the stakes involved. Her page and the interests she addresses continue to attract a specific group of people. These people have morphed into a community of people fighting societal issues, especially as it pertains to women. There are extensive discussions on issues of, say, sexual abuse of both married people and minors, with professional members of her community offering help and support to the victims. As the community continues to grow, she has taken the performance of digital friendship beyond the walls of Instagram and has created a subscription method where her digital friends provide her with personal emails with which she sends monthly subscriptions, sometimes bi-monthly emails that contain clarification on issues on her platform or details on experiences that we often consider too personal to share. As a neoliberal agent at Diary of a Niger Girl, like many other pages like her, capitalizes on her vast yet specialized followership to attract a range of product advertisers whose aim is to reach out and to sell their products to the specialized female, youthful, and liberal audience. This goes ahead to validate the neoliberal tendencies of self-narrativization. It also re-emphasizes the mutual dependency of both marketing and the media. While her brand and community continue to attract product marketers as a self-proclaimed entrepreneur, A Diary of a Niger Girl capitalizes on this female audience to market her brand of skincare products. In marketing skincare products, she leans into this self-narrative strategy of that is, prevalent in her page. She's using her quotidian lifestyle to market the product's efficacy. This demonstration shows us an expression of neoliberalism where digital users begin to describe and understand themselves in relation to markets and consumerist principles. Personal lifestyle and quotidian routine is no longer for the mere sake of living. Personal living is calculative, as the very performance of living now contributes to economic productivity. So scattered around digital platforms are women-led communities selling a variety of self-driven performances, from material objects like hair commodities to service-oriented products like natural hair tutorials to identity-based performances, some of which include performance of daily lives of engaged or interracial or transnational marriages, etc. The active participation of women as prosumers, producers and consumers of the content on these pages, help us validate our claim that Nigerian women are indeed neoliberal agents monetizing self and identity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Adana. So quickly, before we ask the audience to, ask their questions, I'll give a brief summary of Adana's presentation. So Adana starts by explaining how the distinctions between the public and the private has been blurred, especially on social media, and how Nigerian women's experience of this blurred distinctions oppose them as neoliberal agents. She also examines how consumerism has blurred this distinction, and the idea of what is fit or unfit for public consumption is blurred. I'm repeating that word many times, but yes. So yeah, the logic of privacy and publicity in Nigerian space is also questioned by Nigerian women, and she uses and defied by Nigerian women, and she uses the example of Ida Basi's discourse on menstruation while cooking to examine, to exemplify this define of that logic. In addition, she explains how Nigerian women center themselves, how they monetize revelatory content, and how they become neoliberal agents through the use of self-narrativization on social media. In addition, she uses the example of Niger Single Girl and Diary of the Niger Girl to examine how this self-narrativization becomes a viable commodity that can be sold and bought on social media. And in conclusion, our presentation shows how Nigerian women are I can't remember that term, but producers and consumers. Could you repeat the term, please?
It's prosumers.
On social media. So once again, thank you for your presentation. A round of applause for all our presenters. So yes, if we have questions in the chat, if you have any question, you can send them to the chat. You can, I don't know if there are people like physically where you are, Ellen, or if there's also any question from the live audience, we look forward to those questions. So please send in your questions. Okay, we have a question. Oh, okay. Thank you so much for coming. Okay, so while we wait for questions from the audience, do we have, questions from panelists? If there's someone you want to ask in a question, please feel free.
Maybe it's not a question, but more like an observation. It's directed at Yinka. She said something about much of the language that you're using in your work has to do with dialogue, and you're talking, at least to a large extent, I feel like you're talking about how, Nigerian women are reclaiming power and taking things back. Dialogue, in my experience, has to do with, we're sitting down, we're negotiating, we're trying to come to some kind of compromise, basically, right? I'm not fighting you, I'm not taking things back by force. I feel, I'm just saying, maybe it's just me, or it's just a thing about language. I'm just wondering if that language does not in a way contradict the ideas that you're trying to push out there. Dialogue is peaceful. I'm not fighting you. Things like we're just gonna talk, right? I compromise, you compromise. That's the way it works. But if we're thinking about women reclaiming power, it is not, we don't really care whether you like it or not. So I'm just wondering how that language is, working here. That's all.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, for dialoguing, in the field of rhetoric, we have concepts like listening, rhetorical listening, rhetorical silence. So rhetorical dialoguing is peculiar in a way to say that the practice women are engaging in, whether literally or metaphorically, is a kind of dialogue. And I know that dialogue seems peaceful, and it's not always peaceful. But I think the central idea is the discursive nature of sexual. I don't want to use conversation so that it can speak to my discipline. But at the same time, I see the centrality of dialogue. For instance, we've all engaged in dialogue. In our research, you hear scholars say that let the dialogue continue. In our classroom, we say let the dialogue continue. So it doesn't fit the literal definition of dialogue. And even in Helen's presentation, you can see at least a word, I told Oga. So I see that those conversations that are happening where consciously or unconsciously, when people feel like first we have to broach the silence. And so even the internal dialogue with yourself, should I be a virgin? Should I not be a virgin? Should I have this position? Should I have not this position? So you see the engaging happening within yourself. So that's a sense in which dialogue is both a discipline term, but at the same time, it's capturing that underlying thing I see women do, whether with yourself or with other women, or where you question things like the dominant discourses. So that's engagement is what I call dialoguing.
Okay, thank you very much for that response. So we have a couple of questions in the chat. The first question is from Abdullah Abdulsalam. Do you have any book recommendations by Nigerian writers? If you don't mind, could you clarify, what topic you're talking about? So book recommendations on what is it about? Women's sexual desires and what have you. So, but if anyone has any book recommendations, please go ahead. So I'll just okay. So on sex and women pleasure including circumcision. Okay. So does any book come to mind? I think there's this book by I think it's called Naked Agency. I can't remember the title. But I'm just going to Google it and then I'll send it in the chat. Okay, I'll send it to you, Abdullah. So the next question from Rosemary Pokuola. I came when the last presenter was presenting. So I wonder if there is agency in women discussion of pleasure. I've been hearing so much about orgasm coercion here in the West, and I think there's nuance. So I think that question is for Adanna. Is there agency in women discussion of pleasure? I've been hearing so much about orgasm coercion here in the West, and I think there are nuances.
Oh, okay. I'm surprised that the question is for me, actually.
Okay. I think we can put it to everyone on the panel.
Okay.
What do you think? Is there agency in women discussion of pleasure? So I think like Ellen's presentation and Yinka's presentations really touched on that. So would you like to respond to this question, please? Should we start with Ellen? Is there agency in discussion of pleasure?
Yeah, I would say there is, because when women talk about their pleasures, it could be fictionally or it could be experiential. But either way, it's all about what they think about how they can pleasure or how they can get pleasures during sex, or as well as how they have experienced pleasures in sex, or how they feel their partners can pleasure them. But whichever dimension we're taking it from, there's agency in pleasure. But I think I would like to say that in some contexts or climes, women could should I say pretend about their sexual agency, maybe because they don't want to be castigated either for good or for bad. Depending on where they are, women could claim to have attained pleasure during sex. And especially when they are with their sexual partners. Women lie about orgasm and the pleasures they get from sex just to boost the ego of their sexual partners. But more often than not, when it comes to women talking to women about sex, they are always truthful about their agency. They do not lie. They say it the way it is and how they have experienced it.
So I would just thank you. I would just add that even the ability to talk about sex in public spaces, it speaks to that agency. Like, let's broach this thing. Let's take the taboo out of it. And of course, it's we cannot rule out performance. And honestly, it's complex and it's ambivalent. However, for me to come up and even start this conversation on sex means I'm exercising some form of agency. It's a problematic zone, no doubt, but let's start the conversation is even what women are pushing for in most of their discourses, because the silence is causing a whole lot of things, and other people's views and voices, especially the men on pleasure, is problematic for us as women.
Thank you very much. Adana, do you have any response or?
I don't.
All right. So the next question is from Grace Adeni Ogunyaki. It says, I'm incredibly pleased to be part of a conversation on Nigerian women's sexuality and pleasure. I don't really have a question, but I'm curious about how often you come across non-heterosexual sexual agency and pleasure. So, and let's just briefly answer so that we won't run out of time.
Well, I'd like to say that I saw a few stories about that. But considering the fact that the Nigerian society or Nigerian generally is homophobic, women, despite the should I say the agency that social media platform give, women are still self-conscious and are very careful about talking about their sexuality. So for Finn, for instance, as much as Finn poses or claims to be a non-judgment platform, when women talk about their non-heterosexual sexual desires, there's still some measure of judgments about them. So there are very few stories about non-heterosexual sex on thing. I'm not certain about other social media platforms. I think because the Nigerian society is homophobic, non-heterosexual, sexual, maybe should I say practitioners, hardly talk about it. But of course, there are stories about non-heterosexual sex.
All right. So the next question is from Abdullah Abdusalam. How can we help Nigerian men learn women's bodies and please them? Men are the problem.
I can take that one up. Talk. Women, talk to your men. That's where it starts from. Feel comfortable to talk about sex. Especially when you're married. It's amazing that even in the context of marriage, where you're permitted to have sex, women find it difficult to negotiate their sexual agency. So men must be willing to listen. So that's where even though I say it's dialogue with sisters, the dialogue happens with others. But for the play of words, also I'm intentional on saying sisters, but we need to talk about it. Men, you can read books. You have to be open about it. You have to explore together. I'm not a sex activist now. So you just have to have that conversation. Read the same way you inform yourself about other areas of your life where you need knowledge. Go for it. Thank you.
I would also like to add that, like in reference to my data, that beyond being open to dialoguing about sex, men should learn to, should I say, put in mind and practice what their women want for sex. Like some of the women noted that despite having them shared their notion or how they want to be pleased to their spouse, the men do not take to it. They might do it the day they might pleasure them the day if they talk about it, but subsequently it's either the men choose to forget or they forget, or they just don't do it. So I think according to my data, according to my data, it appears some of the men are selfish. They are just all out for their sexual pleasure. So for the only way I think that men can please their women beyond dialoguing about it or hearing what the woman wants, they should internalize their women's wants and act it out during every sexual encounter.
Okay. Thank you very much. The next question, I would like to know the veracity of the experiences online for research purposes. Lots of people project false experiences. How does academic research take into factor echo chambers, misinformation, etc.?
Can I start?
Yes, please.
I would say that yes, I agree that a lot of these stories lack veracity. But the thing is, I am not claiming about. I didn't talk about experiences like personal experiences or the rest of all that. Like, I'm not saying now some of these stories could be fictional. That is a fact. But my argument is whether it is fictional or real. What comes into play is the fact that the representation or the notion of women's pleasurable sex in those stories shows how women want to have their sex. So whether they have experienced it, they want to have experienced it, they are wishing that they're experiencing, they're experiencing it. It just shows how much pleasure they want to have from sex.
Okay.
Well, I'll just add that veracity is one thing, and it's even the same when you're on the field and you're talking to someone face to face, you can't even tell which part of the story is true. But what we are dealing with is what does this conversations help us understand? What does the stories illustrate for us? What are the possibilities that it allows for? So I think veracity would always be a question that will be present in research, but we have to select what are we focusing on, and while we acknowledge the limitation of whatever method space we are getting our data from.
And just to add, I think it's also important to differentiate, to understand the difference between an echo chamber and a safe space. Because what could be seen as a safe space for a lot of these women who are sharing their experiences, could be seen as an echo chamber for people who are not, who are not in that space. So I think it's also important to look at one's bias as well when we are, trying to figure out what these spaces mean. The next question is from Naluwembe. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. A question to all the speakers. First, they said, thank you for a great panel. A question to all the speakers. Are you seeing examples of an intergenerational conversation between women, and are these conversations moving offline? Yeah, I think this is a good question as well. Okay, who wants to go first?
Okay, I'll go first. Maybe because using Finn, for instance, I think that those conversations are actually going on because the people who are on Finn are not just contemporary people. It's not just people, the Gen Z and the millennials. There are a lot of older women who are on Finn. So I believe that these conversations are going on. You see people who are a lot older who come in with the experiences and talk about these experiences alongside young people. So I think that in many ways that an intergenerational conversation is happening between older and younger women, not just on social media, in a way that probably that's not happening in real time, if I may put it that way, in the sense that in real time, these women might not be very bold to talk about these things, right? But they come online and they can, that you can feign anonymity and discuss these things and talk about how your own experiences can benefit the younger ones. So I think these conversations are happening. It depends on the way that you're looking at it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Next question. My question is to Adana from Damilare. Thank you for showing us how Nigerian women's neoliberal actions upset cultural logics of public and private interactions. I want to ask if your work considers how women's agency might itself undermine neoliberal logics?
Okay, I would like to respond to this question. I would like to understand what neoliberalism is basically doing, right? We're thinking about privatization of public resources. We're thinking about, elimination of price controls. We're thinking about so many things that have to do with markets, right? Everything, consumerist principles all over the place, right? So you're thinking about women's agency, especially in the context of the work that I have just presented. Women's agency is coming from creating communities where these women talk about their experiences, or where these women, explore several issues, right? So I don't think necessarily, I would not say that it necessarily undermines neoliberalism in a way. You can look at it two ways. You can say it does, because neoliberalism, people assume, is mindless and soulless, right? It's just about the profit. It's just about making money, right? And so communities might be considered a byproduct of that process, right? But in my opinion, it's not particularly a byproduct of the process. It is rather a strategy of that process, right? You create communities, especially for people who have marketing in mind. You create these communities, and when you have created a trusted community, you can be able to market these products, and people will believe what you're selling. So yeah, I wouldn't particularly, that question, as interesting as it is, I do not have a very direct answer to it. You might say, if you consider neoliberalism as completely soulless and mindless, then yes, it does. But if you don't, if you see these things as strategies, then it is only a strategy to selling those products and making profit, which is the main aim and logic of neoliberalism.
Right. Thank you very much. Next we have a question from Thomas Todo. As young parents caught between a receding world and the current virtual digital world, where the private space is blurred, what do you think should be one's parental roles in properly leading one's words to navigate the new world, precisely on issues about one's sexual orientation and worldview? So how should parents, help their children navigate this world? Yeah, please. I think this question is for Adana, and if any other person wants to respond quickly.
Okay. I'm not an advocate. I wouldn't say I'm an expert on children's psychology or things like that, but I would say that, understanding the times for parents is very crucial, right? A lot of parents spend so much time, trying to fight the new world, always reminiscing about how things were in the past without truly understanding that things are moving very fast and quick, right? So you just have to get your kids acquainted with, or help your kids understand this change in dynamics, right? Help them understand the way the world is moving. And when you do that, you're guiding them, you're giving them principles that you live by, right? There's no way the blurring lines between the private and the public is going to keep blurring. And at some point, we might not see where those margins exist anymore. So I think the responsibility of the parents is just, if you have values, if you have things that you consider values that are important to you, that you want to instill in your kids so that they can be able to navigate those things on their own, it's your responsibility to do that. There's no manual on how to handle that. It's just, the way that it's just raising your kids on specific principles that help them deal with the world out there.
Okay.
I would also like to add that the question reminds me of the conversation I had with Dr. Adimola yesterday about parenting and heterosexuality. I would just like to say that in addition to what Adana said, I think parents also may need to be liberal and open-minded to some extent. Like the dynamics of parenting is fast changing, but so one has to put in mind that that one's notion or approach to parenting is changing. And then since the world is also changing, it is imperative that every parent moves along, despite despite their perception of what they think should be the norm. Then finally, I would like to say that I am organizing and sharing a panel on parenting in Africa. And the first part of the panel will hold later today by 5:30 p.m. to 7 p.m. So you're welcome to join the panel on the conversation on parenting in Africa.
Thank you very much. So quickly, we have less than 8 minutes. So briefly, we'll respond to the other questions. Tolulokpe Adelabu's question said, I think this is to Adana. I wonder, or anyone on the panel. Oh, I'm frozen. Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
I wonder if we are not reflecting non-Western ways of discussing and expressing perceived silence about gendered or female issues, whether biological, sexual, work, marriage, etc. So if we can have 1 or 2 responses to that question, and then we'll move to the next one.
Well, I can say that given the global world we have, such conversations cannot but come up, and we cannot ignore that. So there are influences on what our own conceptualization of sexual pleasure is. For instance, you will see women cite a resource or a link to an article that is from a West. I wonder if we are not neglecting non-Western ways. Okay, I see. So I think one of the conversation is whether we like it or not, there are influences on the West on how women talk about sex, on how women project sex, and we cannot rule that out. But I think one way this comes up for me is the richness of our language in how we talk about sex and express sex. That is where the non-Western is coming up for me. But in terms of the ideas also, we cannot rule out the influences of the West. But there are concepts that are just, or experiences that are just particular to us. For instance, associating pleasure with the waist bead, ileke-idi, the kaya matters. So these are experiences that are unique to us and ways that will bring it when it comes to when it comes to sex. I don't know if that answers the question, but the West and the non-Western would always be in conversation.
And just to add, I think there's also, the distinction between the platform and the content. So the platform may be Western, right? Created by someone from the West, but then the content and the people using that platform will define how it works, right? And so, these discourses and the way they are being had is defined by the people within that platform. And just like, during Ellen's presentation, she said she searched for words like bula when she was looking at discourses on sex, and these words are obviously non-Western, right? So yeah, the next question, okay, it's a comment. Ellen mentioned something about men needing women for sexual pleasure and vice versa. I feel this is not always the case, and of course this doesn't accommodate bisexuality, which is besides the point. Thank you very much for your comment. Next question from Olorunbe. Ellen, your presentation actually speaks to the fact of women orgasm, and all presenters touch on the areas around the topic. To the 3 presenters, briefly, don't you think selective orgasm is a variable to consider based on the female anatomy? So anyone wants to respond to that? Okay, Yinka.
What does selective orgasm means?
Okay. All right. Okay, let's just move on to the other questions. We have...
The person can type what it means so that it will help us understand how to answer.
Okay, so we have book suggestions or book titles from Oluwashola Daniels. The next question to Dr. Uga, I want to know what she meant by non-committed sex in a presentation.
Yeah, when I saw the question, I was trying to non-committal sex. Okay, that is sex actual outside relationship, what we call hookup in today's parlance.
Okay, thank you. Ayo, Says, thank you all for your presentations. My question is to Scholar Ellen Uga. I would like to know, is sex defined by space alone? Because I didn't hear you explore the other aspects of sex, like phone sexing, text sexing, which lead to orgasm. Suggestion, your sources of data gathering can be expanded. I think you can read that, right? But like to the question, would you like
Well,
to respond to the
well, I would say that I was actually interested in. Okay, yes, I do agree with the person, but considering the fact that I work with stories, this didn't feature in the stories. If they did, I'm sure I would have talked about it.
Thank you. Another comment, just like Inka said, women need to be more open on saying what they enjoy. It's a much changed world than in the past. There are lots of men who want to please their women. Maybe a research can be done on that. I think this person making this comment can do that research. I believe to maximally please their women. Next question. Okay, we have a book title from Rosemary Popola. Thank you very much. Simidele Doshekun's book, Fashioning Post-Feminism. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for the book title as well, to our anonymous attendee. Next question is from Moses. How do we delineate between natural sexual expectations of women and the ones shaped by extreme sexual performances and reorientation, such as porn, dildo, etc., flying on digital spaces? Don't we think these have sexual expectations? Okay, yeah, if anyone can respond to that question.
Well, let me go through the question again, because now women's natural, see, whether it's natural or is dictated by extremism, I would say that as far as the woman is maybe opening to trying it, she feels it will give her pleasure. Because like I said earlier on, women prefer pain-free sex to painful sex. So if they are deriving pleasure from the pain, then they're enjoying the sex. So whether it's extreme or it is their desire, if they consider it pleasurable, then this is what they want.
So I just want to add that there are constructs on what sex is, and that's where comes whether it's natural or not. So but the point is there is the presence of sexual pleasure, and how you tend to fulfill that sexual pleasure is also shaped by these social-cultural influences we've been talking about. And so there are performances, there are affordances of the digital space, and there are also limitations. And in the online focus group discussions I do, that's one of the things women bring up. But they are all part of the conversation that make it rich for exploration. So thank you.
So we have, okay, I think Helen is answering already. Adana from Rosemary Popola. Adana may want to consider Simidele's book, Fashioning Post-Feminism. It could be possible that it's not all neoliberalism. I follow Sellers of Kayamata, and growing up in the North, okay, I think there could be nuances to consider about sexuality and pleasure of women. Okay, when Tiwa Savage said Ofi Oko Shemileche, is she drawing from Western? It could be possible to decolonize how we research sexual pleasure. My final comment. Thank you very much for that comment. I believe we have answered all the questions, and we really thank our the audience. We thank the audience so much for their questions. Thank you very much for the comments as well. Once again, thank you to all our presenters. Thank you for your for giving us, presentations that gave so much stimulating conversations. And I really hope these conversations will continue even outside this space. Thank you once again. And yes, don't forget to attend Ellen Uga's panel on parenting. Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you once. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Mosumala, we couldn't get to the selective orgasm thing, but that I don't know if there is access to that person's email so that they